Thank you very much, Alistair, for reminding us of the beginnings. In fact, in 2002, you can see how cautious, complicated, and slow this process was. It was a very raucous meeting at the MRC, even as to the acceptability of UK Biobank. So it's been a long process with the Interim Governance Council, and now we'll have, I think you were the first chair, right, Graeme, of the Ethics and Governance Council? So you were the first of the interim, then of the first, and the main one. And Graeme, I think the last point on your slides, Alistair, I think make a perfect transition to Graeme's topic, and he'll take us further on the role of the Ethics and Governance Council. Graeme Laurie from Edinburgh.
Thank you, Barta. Good morning, colleagues. Yes, I've been asked to talk about the role of the Ethics and Governance Council as critical friend, and I think that's actually a very helpful moniker to actually sort of try and sum up the ways in which this governance arrangement is effectively a big experiment in governance. And I think it's an attempt to try to add value to what already exists in regulatory and other terms with respect to the sorts of rules, regulations, procedures, etc., that something like UK Biobank is subject to. So I want to frame my entire talk around this notion of ethics and the Council as being a critical friend. And as Barta said, I was the second chair of the Council, and that chairmanship lasted from 2006 to 2010, which more or less coincided exactly with the recruitment period. I took up my role just before recruitment started, and I stepped down just after recruitment ended. So it was a really nice sort of discrete moment. I'd like to share with you some of my experience during that time. Here's my broad overview for the talk. First of all, picking up a little bit more and getting some depth on the rationale for the Council itself in this role as critical friend. And then secondly, exploring a little bit more its remit and also how the relationship with UK Biobank has been envisaged and also how we managed it in the course of my chairmanship. I'd also like to then give you some examples of the way in which I think we can point to quite concrete examples of where the Ethics and Governance Council has been responsive, has actually stepped up to the challenge of assisting a big project like this, which is prospective and looking forward, and when we have so many uncertainties involved, how it can actually monitor and advise in ways that allow the Council to be responsive and allow UK Biobank in turn to respond to the sorts of challenges that arise when they have not been foreseen at all, even something like the Ethics and Governance Framework. And finally, what I'd like to offer you are some personal reflections on the Ethics and Governance Council, and also the governance experiment itself. And these were reflections that I sort of undertook after I stood down from the role, and it might actually help some of the conversations that Roger called for earlier on this morning to try and frame our discussion today and tomorrow. So the rationale for the EGC, why have an Ethics and Governance Council in addition? And the key words here, I think, are in addition to the fact that UK Biobank is subject to all the complex domestic and European legislation with respect to data protection, with respect to any clinical trials that it might be sort of linked to. Remember, at this time, we're talking about the aftermath of the so-called Alder Hey and Bristol scandals, the developments of the Human Tissue Act, another labyrinthine piece of legislation. All the legal framework was already either in existence or was being developed. And the question was, well, why would you have something in addition to all of that? Would that not just represent undue regulatory burden? My view would be, and I think the view of the funders that picked up the recommendations from the IAG, is that no, this is not yet another example of regulation, a top-down command and control model. This is a governance arrangement which actually sits to the side of UK Biobank rather than tries to impose control and compliance from a top-down perspective. And the reason why that was thought to be important was because of, as we know, the nature of broad consent, which at that time was particularly controversial as an acceptable ethical way to proceed. The long-term and therefore uncertain nature of the endeavour, we just don't know what's going to come up, and I'll give some examples of exactly how that proved to be true in development. And also, despite the fact that we do have incredible amounts of regulation within the UK and Europe and beyond, there are still some gaps. And in particular, at that time, monitoring of research was not within the remit of research ethics committees. So UK Biobank, like any other big initiative, would have to get upfront ethical approval, but you did not have that follow through to then monitor what happened thereafter and advise accordingly. So there was a gap despite the regulatory Leviathan. So it was felt and was argued, and the recommendation was accepted, that a council would be an additional safeguard, a foundation for trust, and it would act as a trusted third party, as a critical friend. The mantra of the council became, and it may still be, that the council is there to speak about UK Biobank, not for UK Biobank. And I would say actually one of the biggest challenges that I certainly faced as a chair, and the members of the council at the time that I was chair, was trying to actually get that message across. There was a lot of confusion about the relationship between the council as this independent arm's-length body that monitors and advises, as opposed to it being an entity of UK Biobank itself. Alistair mentioned the public consultations. Now, those have been subjected to some criticism, actually, whether or not they were sufficiently robust in terms of social science, etc. But one of the key messages that did come out was the strong sense that there was a need for an oversight body that could be established, that could act independently, both of the users and of the funders, that it could behave in a manner that would reflect public mood as this might change over time, and also ensure that the original terms of the consent were respected over that time period. Making sure that there was no funny business going on. Social scientists love the quotes from what actually comes out of engagement with publics. But a really interesting point, the second bullet point here, was that there was consensus that not only should the council be populated with experts from a range of different areas, but there was also a sense that there should be one or two UK Biobank participants. And certainly during my time as the chair, I think we had at least 2 conversations about whether or not we should have represented our so-called representative participants on the council. Without doing any sort of injustice to the council members at that time, I think the reason why we said no on both occasions is roughly threefold. First of all, a practical issue, that how can you be representative of 500,000 plus participants? Secondly, the sense that actually there was a concern that it would be tokenistic and it might actually be captured with particular interest groups rather than actually looking more broadly into the resource as a genuine resource for public good. And thirdly, linked to that last point, if this is a resource for the public good, why should the participants themselves have any privileged position with respect to any other members of the public out there? So representativeness was an interesting one, and it wasn't something that was picked up either in the ethics and governance framework, nor was it picked up in the course of my chairmanship. And finally, it was felt that this entity was could use as a benchmark the Nolan principles for public life, and that would be a good sounding board to ensure that what it did was always accountable and open to public scrutiny, and that's the reason why the minutes are publicly available. In terms of the relationship, I want to pick up something that Alistair was saying there about the bark or the bite. So another metaphor that we used a lot with respect to the nature of the horizontal relationship between the Council and UK Biobank was this idea that the Council was there to hold a mirror up to UK Biobank to reflect on its ethical conduct and its future proposals and its policies. But there was, and there is within the EGF, a mechanism for escalating any questions or concerns that the Council might have. So obviously what happens is the direct dialogue and engagement with UK Biobank in the course of the Council's meetings and in between. But however, it's possible for the Council to make a formal statement, either of concern or more generally to the board and to the funders, and if necessary, to use a comment that Alistair's deployed in the past, there's the nuclear option of going public. Going public, there really was a concern, and you can imagine then there might be fallout there with people withdrawing left, right and centre. We should never underestimate the potential power of that, but it is very much a nuclear option. It's only available once. I can give you an example, a concrete example of how, however, of when during my chairmanship, we actually did take an issue to the board. I wrote a letter to the board on behalf of the Council because we felt at that time UK Biobank needed to do more and have more support for getting its own ethical house in order. If the Ethics and Governance Council is genuinely an independent arm-led body, it's not for the Council to tell UK Biobank what to do on any given policy. UK Biobank has to come up with its own policies, and then the Council will comment on those and monitor those accordingly. So we wrote a letter to the board, and that led to a full discussion, which in turn led to the appointment, I think, of Mike Parker and other colleagues at Oxford who then acted as advisors to UK Biobank itself. So the mechanism there of escalation doesn't necessarily have to be one of confrontation. It can actually be really helpful in calibrating the various relationships that are actually in play in this complex governance dynamic. It's also really important, I think, to point out what the Council is not there to do. And as it flows naturally from what I've just said, it's absolutely not there to assume responsibility for the ethical management of the resource. That's for UK Biobank. And it's there to speak on behalf, so not there to speak on behalf of UK Biobank, but about UK Biobank. And therefore, this ethics and governance framework, as Alistair said as well earlier on, is very much a living instrument. There have been examples where the Council has suggested to UK Biobank there needs to be amendment or addition or revision of the Council, of the framework, because it needs to keep up with the current state of scientific and ethical play. So let me give you a very concrete example of that that happened in the period 2006 to 2010. In the ethics and governance framework, there's three ways in which a participant can withdraw, and this is the relevant one here. It's possible to request no further use, and this is the text directly from the framework. So in addition to no longer contacting the participant or obtaining further information, UK Biobank will destroy all of the health-related information and samples collected previously, subject to, of course, information that's gone beyond its control or samples that have been depleted. And only some administrative details, such as their signed consent and withdrawal, would be kept as a record of their wishes. That was the original version of the no further use provision within the framework. It became clear, however, as UK Biobank was developing the IT and technical security side of things, that actually it wasn't possible to honour that. For IT technical reasons that I only hold on to in comprehension terms by my fingernails, the technical systems required the retention of information to show that somebody had been deleted from the system, so you're still able to sort of say somebody had been in the system, if that makes sense. So as a strict matter of interpretation, UK Biobank, it seemed, could no longer honour that particular commitment. So that triggered a dialogue between UKB and the Council as to what should happen. It was very iterative, it went on for quite a long time. Because time is short, what we ended up recommending was the following: that there needed to be a change to the ethics and governance framework. So yes, it's the case that any information and samples collected previously would no longer be available to researchers, but you also requested the addition, which was put in, of the phraseology, and any information would only be held for archival audit purposes. Now, there was partly a discussion about whether or not there should be recontact of people who had already consented, but partly for the reasons that Mike mentioned earlier on, which are cost, but of course cost doesn't trump ethics. It was felt that that would be a disproportionate response to try and contact all those people who'd actually already consented, because there was other things that could be done. The EGF could be changed, a new information leaflet could be revised, new pages could be put up on UK Biobank and the EGC websites, and that's what happened. It was felt that that was an appropriate and proportionate response, because the original idea that we will respect your wish no longer to be involved still remained intact. This was a technical matter. It was not fundamentally an ethical issue. Another challenge that popped up was basically a question that was asked of us by what seemed like two separate sources. Could UK Biobank be a resource for cloning? They didn't quite put it as crudely as that, but that was what was being asked. And these were two separate letters that came to the Council in a short period of time, and we responded reminding the individuals what the Council was there to do and what it wasn't there to do. But the fundamental question was, bearing in mind that this is a public resource for health-related research, you could not rule out the fact that there may well be a request to access the resource at some point for certain types of technology. You couldn't rule that out, because health-related is determinedly a very broadly defined provision. What then happened was the two individuals in question wrote an opinion piece that appeared in The Lancet, which, as far as we were concerned, was replete with errors. It misunderstood the nature of the relationship between UK Biobank and the Council, and also we felt it was unduly scaremongering. We tried to respond with an opinion piece in kind, but The Lancet, being The Lancet, said, no, our policy is you can only reply with a 250-word letter. So that really required the Council to concentrate its key message back. But I think, looking back at that letter, actually, in reflection, the key messages that we sent back were, first of all, it was important to disabuse those individuals, but others as well, about the fact that the council has any say in the access policies. That's not what the council is there to do. It's there to monitor and advise at arm's length. Secondly, we've confirmed that the council's role into the future is always to pay attention to the interests of the participants relative to what they signed up to in the consent form and the ethics and governance framework. We reiterated, however, the broad nature of the consent, and that was for health-related purposes. But what we couldn't do and would not do is engage in speculative ethics, imagining any future circumstance where there might be a request to use the resource in those for those purposes. The council refused to do that. It's not its role to engage in speculative ethics or to imagine Frankenstein futures. We pointed out, however, that a future council has in place a robust mechanism to respond to that, because social mores may well have changed at that point. And of course, the fundamental sort of legal response to this would be, well, it's a bit like somebody saying, oh, well, be careful, you could be sued. Well, that's true, you could be sued for anything, but the chances of being successful might be marginal. So yes, somebody could ask to use UK Biobank for cloning research, but the chances of them actually, A, having a yes from UK Biobank, and B, getting through all the regulatory mechanisms are negligible at best. So this speculative notion we felt was unhelpful, and we tried to make that point in our response. My final 2 slides are just my own personal reflections on all of this. When I stepped down in 2010, it coincided with BARTA putting together a special issue on biobanking for human genetics. And I was charged with looking at the limits of law and the role of policy approaches. And it's important to bear in mind that all of this has happened without legislative change or intervention in the UK. This is very much a sort of, if you like, a grassroots mechanism that has developed. What I suggest in my article in that 2011 issue is that UK Biobanking is an example of what I call reflexive governance. And my definition for that is at the top here. I think it's a system of in-parallel development and partnership in governance, typified by arrangements which facilitate mutual learning over time. And I go on to argue that there are features of this that we can identify, such as there being guiding principles to delimit that relationship, that they promote reflexivity between the partners, they provide an integrity of purpose, such as the ethics and governance framework, but they also require proportionality of action. And I think that response that we had to the IT issue is an instance of that in action. Also, it would require stakeholder involvement, and not just a council or an entity acting as a critical friend, but also ongoing engagement with participants and public. So certainly during my chairmanship, we had public meetings, but also, and fundamentally, it has to be something as a governance mechanism that adds value to what already exists. We do not need yet more regulatory or quasi-regulatory burden in this field. My own view on reflection is that this mechanism actually does add value. The framework gives us the integrity of purpose. It gives us the benchmark against which we can measure all action from UK Biobank. The council itself operates, as I hope I've demonstrated, as an independent critical friend. We must also remember that at the time of the IAG and beyond that, there was in parallel development both of the protocol and the governance mechanism. So when we were deliberating, it still wasn't clear how the funders were going to set up UK Biobank. So there was a lot of to and fro, so it had to be adaptive. I think the mechanism we have is also reflexive, and I think that what it needs moving forward is constant engagement with participants and publics to make sure that it is maintained for mutual benefit and overarchingly for the public benefit. If you'd like to read about that, that's the article there, but for now, thank you very much for your patience.